The parking lot is empty except for 2 cars. It's a Tuesday morning in late October, and the Chicago wind carries the kind of cold that cuts through layers. 2 couples stand on opposite sides of a vacant lot in the Jefferson Park neighborhood, each holding folders. Each folder contains a deed. Each deed describes the same address. Neither couple knows the other exists. The Hendersons arrived first. They'd been coming to this address for 6 months, imagining themselves here, planning furniture layouts, discussing which room would be the guest bedroom. They'd stood in this exact spot before, but always with Elena, always with her pointing to blueprints, explaining the current phase of construction, assuring them that the building permits were being finalized, that the developers team was ahead of schedule. The lot had always felt full of potential when Elena was present. Now, without her narration, it's just dirt and scraggly grass and the skeletal frame of a distant construction site that belongs to someone else. The Chuns arrived 15 minutes later. They'd purchased 3 months ago. They too had walked this lot with Elena, though on a different day, at a different time. She'd worn different clothes, styled her hair differently. But the story was the same. Exclusive access, early bird pricing, a development that insiders knew about before it hit the market. They'd felt chosen, privileged. When the 2 families see each other, confusion moves across their faces like weather. The Hendersons' real estate attorney, who'd flown in from Milwaukee to oversee the closing, begins checking his paperwork. The Chun's attorney does the same. Both are looking at documents that appear identical in all respects, except one. The buyer names are different. Within an hour, someone calls the city assessor's office. Within 2 hours, someone calls the Chicago Police Department. Within 3 hours, both families understand that they are not the first people to receive a deed to this address. They are not the second. They are part of a pattern that, when fully investigated, will reveal 17 properties sold across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. 17 addresses. 17 families. Approximately $4 million extracted from people who believed they were making the safest investment possible, real estate. By the end of the day, Elena Voss is gone. Her office on Michigan Avenue, which had been pristine and professional just hours before, is being photographed by forensic accountants. Her phone is off. Her email is deleted. The woman who had spent 18 months convincing these families that she was the most trustworthy person in the room, the woman who had promised them a future, documented it, notarized it, assured them it was real, has evaporated. But she didn't vanish. Not really. She simply stepped out of the constructed reality she'd been maintaining and into another one. And this is where her story actually begins. Not with the discovery, but with the choice that led to it. Not with the exposure, but with the incremental moments that made exposure inevitable. The question that will haunt everyone involved is not, how did she do this? But rather, how did we not see it? And the answer to that question reveals something more disturbing than the crime itself. We didn't see it because we didn't want to. We didn't see it because Elena understood something fundamental about human nature. She understood that people will believe almost anything if it promises them what they desperately want. She understood that trust is not something we extend cautiously. It's something we extend eagerly to anyone who seems to understand our hunger. What follows is the architecture of that hunger, the construction of a lie so elaborate, so meticulously detailed, that it became indistinguishable from truth. And the woman at its center, who may have lost track of which version of herself was real. Elena Voss was born in 1978 in a suburb northwest of Chicago. Her father was a union electrician. Her mother was a secretary. They were not wealthy, but they were stable. They believed in the American narrative. Work hard, save money, invest in property, build equity. The house they owned was modest, a 1970s ranch with avocado green kitchen appliances and a basement that flooded every spring. But it was theirs. They owned it. In the language of her parents' generation, owning a home was the fundamental marker of success, of having made it, of belonging to a world that mattered. Elena absorbed this narrative completely. It became part of her psychological architecture in ways she wouldn't fully understand until much later. A home was not just shelter. It was proof. It was validation. It was the material manifestation of having your life together. When Elena was 14, her father suffered a stroke. It was not catastrophic. He recovered most of his motor function, but it was enough to disrupt the family's economic stability. Medical bills accumulated. Her mother took a second job. The narrative that had felt so secure began to fracture. The house remained, but the feeling of having made it, of having succeeded, was replaced by a persistent anxiety. They still owned it, but now ownership felt fragile. Elena became hyper-aware of class. She noticed which girls in her high school wore designer jeans and which didn't. She noticed which families took vacations and which didn't. She noticed which neighborhoods were considered desirable and which were where people from families like hers lived. The noticing created a wound, a sense of being just outside a circle she desperately wanted to enter. She was intelligent. She was attractive. She was socially capable. But she was not wealthy. And in high school, that mattered more than anything else. By the time she was 17, she had developed a compensatory skill. She could read people. She could understand what they wanted before they understood it themselves. She could present herself as whatever would make her desirable to them. It was a survival mechanism. It was also a foundational skill for a particular kind of deception. Elena went to DePaul University and studied business. She graduated in 2000, just as the dot-com bubble was inflating, just as everyone was talking about real estate as an investment vehicle, just as the narrative shifted from home as shelter to home as asset. The timing was perfect. The economy was expanding. Chicago was booming. Money was everywhere, or seemed to be. She got her real estate license in 2001. The market was still strong. For her first 3 years, Elena did well. She was good at her job. She was personable. She understood what buyers wanted, not just a house, but a story about themselves. A narrative in which they were successful, making smart decisions, moving upward in the world. She sold them that narrative along with the property. But by 2004, the market had shifted. The easy money had been made. The competition had intensified. Elena was now competing against agents who had more experience, better connections, and higher social capital than she did. She was still good at her job, but good was no longer enough. Good was ordinary. The wound from her adolescence, the sense of being just outside the circle, began to reopen. She had an apartment in a modest neighborhood. She had a reliable car. She had a decent income. But she was surrounded by agents who had homes in Lincoln Park, vacations in Europe, the kind of effortless success that seemed to come from belonging to a world she still didn't fully access. The gap between who she was and who she wanted to be was painfully visible every day. In 2005, a client came to her with an unusual request. He was looking for early access to a luxury development before it officially hit the market. He had money, but more importantly, he had a hunger for exclusivity. He wanted to feel like an insider. He wanted to know something other people didn't know. He wanted access. Elena told him she would see what she could do. She didn't have early access. There was no insider network. But she understood his hunger, and she understood that he would believe her if she presented confidence convincingly enough. She fabricated an email from a developer she'd never met, suggesting that a property was available for early consideration. She showed it to her client. He believed it. He bought the property. He was happy. He felt chosen. And Elena had solved a problem. She'd made money without competing in the legitimate market. She'd created value through information asymmetry, the simple act of knowing something or claiming to know something that someone else desperately wanted to know. The satisfaction she felt was immediate and profound. For the first time in her professional life, she wasn't competing. She was transcending competition. She was operating in a different sphere entirely. She was an insider, or at least she could perform being an insider convincingly enough that it felt real. This was the moment. This was the choice point where her trajectory could have diverged. She could have recognized the deception as a one-time aberration, a line crossed in a moment of desperation that she would never cross again. But she didn't. She recognized it as a solution, a way to belong, a way to transcend the class anxiety that had never left her. Over the next 18 months, she did it again and again. Each time, the lie was larger. Each time, she involved more people. Each time, she created more elaborate documentation. And each time, the satisfaction of success was followed by a deeper hunger. She'd discovered a narcotic, and the dose kept needing to increase. By 2007, when the real estate market began to crack, Elena had already begun building something different. While legitimate agents watched their commissions collapse, Elena was constructing an empire of illusion. She understood something her competitors didn't. In a market of uncertainty, people didn't need truth. They needed certainty. They needed someone who seemed to know what was coming next. They needed to believe in something, and Elena had become expert at giving them something to believe in. The irony is that Elena herself believed in the narrative she was constructing. She didn't experience herself as a liar. She experienced herself as someone who understood the market more deeply than others. Someone who had insider knowledge. Someone who belonged to a privileged circle. This is the most dangerous kind of deception. The kind where the deceiver has begun to believe their own mythology. Where the constructed identity has become so thorough, so elaborate, so consistently maintained that it has replaced the authentic self. Elena Voss was no longer a woman from a modest family compensating for class anxiety. She was an insider. She had insider access. She had insider knowledge. And everyone who wanted to believe in that narrative wanted to believe in her. What happened over the next decade was not the story of a criminal. It was the story of someone slowly disappearing into a fictional version of herself. It was the story of a woman who had learned to construct reality so convincingly that she could no longer distinguish between the ones she created and the ones that existed independently of her will, and the people around her, the families who trusted her, the lawyers who reviewed her documents, the inspectors who verified her claims, were not stupid. They were simply human. They saw what they wanted to see. They believed what they wanted to believe. They participated in the construction of Elena's fictional world because that world promised them something real, a future secured, an investment protected, a narrative in which they were making smart decisions. The real tragedy of Elena Voss's story is not that she deceived people, it's that she became her own deception. And by the time anyone discovered what had happened, it was too late to reach the person she might have been. Understanding Elena's victims requires understanding something uncomfortable about human psychology. We don't evaluate information neutrally. We evaluate it through the lens of what we hope is true. We are not rational creatures who gather facts and draw conclusions. We are narrative creatures who construct stories and then gather facts that confirm those stories. The real estate market amplifies this tendency. When someone is considering purchasing a property, they are not simply making a financial decision. They are engaged in a profound act of imagination. They are projecting themselves into a future. They are telling themselves a story about who they will be in that space, what kind of life they will live, what kind of person they will become. A home is not just an asset. It is a statement about identity. It is proof of arrival. In 2009, Marcus and Patricia Henderson were in their early 50s. Marcus had spent 30 years as a middle manager at an insurance company. Patricia had raised their 2 children and then worked as a dental hygienist. They were solidly middle class. They owned a home in suburban Milwaukee, nothing fancy, but paid off. They had retirement savings. They had done what they were supposed to do, but they had never quite arrived. They had never quite felt secure. There was always the sense that they were one economic downturn away from precarity. They had worked hard, but their hard work had not translated into the kind of security they'd imagined when they were younger. The American narrative promised them that if they worked hard, saved money, and invested wisely, they would be fine. But fine was all they'd managed. They hadn't transcended. They hadn't arrived. When Marcus's company offered early retirement packages in 2009, it felt like an opportunity, a reset, a chance to liquidate a portfolio that had been decimated by the market collapse and reinvest it in something tangible, something real. A home in Chicago, in a neighborhood that was appreciating, in a development that was being built by a major developer, seemed like the smart move, especially if they could get in early, at a discount, before the market recovered. This is where Elena found them, on an online forum for real estate investors. Marcus had posted about his interest in early access properties in Chicago. Elena responded privately, claiming to represent a development company that was offering exclusive early access to a luxury project in Jefferson Park. The project, she explained, was not yet public. The developer was being selective about early buyers. They wanted quality investors who understood the value of being in on the ground floor. They wanted people like Marcus and Patricia. Marcus was intrigued. Patricia was skeptical. But Patricia's skepticism was not about whether the opportunity was real. It was about whether they could afford it. The asking price for the unit, $485,000, was significantly higher than what their retirement savings could cover. But Elena had an answer for that too. The developer, she explained, had arranged financing options for qualified early buyers, low down payments, favorable terms, structured specifically for retirees. What Patricia didn't understand, and what Elena understood completely, was that the skepticism Patricia felt was not a sign that she should be cautious. It was a sign that she wanted this badly enough that she was willing to override her skepticism. The doubt was not protective. It was an obstacle to the narrative she wanted to construct. Elena's strategy was simple but brilliant. She didn't try to overwhelm them with information. She provided just enough to confirm what they already wanted to believe. She showed them architectural renderings of the development, professional, glossy, showing luxury finishes and an outdoor courtyard and a gym. She showed them documentation from the city, confirming that permits had been filed. She showed them information about the neighborhood crime rates declining, property values appreciating, schools improving. All of it was real information about real trends, but it was attached to a property that did not exist. What Elena understood, and what made her dangerous, was this. She wasn't lying about whether the neighborhood was good. She wasn't lying about whether real estate appreciated. She wasn't lying about whether luxury developments were built in Chicago. She was lying about one specific thing, whether this specific development, in this specific location, on this specific timeline, was real. And she was embedding that lie within a context of truth that made it almost impossible to detect. Marcus and Patricia visited the property twice. Both times, Elena took them to the lot, walked them through the space, described the planned layout, pointed to the neighboring properties to show them the quality of construction in the area. The lot was indeed empty, but Elena had a narrative prepared. The foundation work was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. The current phase was geological surveys and utility planning. This was normal. This made sense. This confirmed the narrative that they were getting in early, before construction began in earnest. Patricia asked reasonable questions. Why hadn't the property been advertised more widely? Elena answered, the developer was being selective, maintaining exclusivity for early investors, preventing the market from being flooded with casual buyers who didn't understand long-term investment. This was actually how some developments worked. Elena's lie was embedded in a truth that made the lie invisible. Why were the financing terms so favorable? Elena answered, the developer was securing early capital and in exchange offered incentive pricing and financing. Again, this happened in the real estate market. Elena wasn't inventing implausible explanations. She was using real market mechanisms to justify her fabrications. Patricia's skepticism began to fade, not because the evidence convinced her, but because Elena had provided a compelling narrative that explained all of the uncertainty away. The doubt didn't disappear. It transformed into excitement. The doubt became the feeling of being in on something exclusive. The doubt became the feeling of being chosen. Marcus and Patricia signed the purchase agreement in October 2009. They provided a down payment of $45,000. This was not casual money. This was retirement savings. This was security. But they had displaced the risk onto a narrative. If they focused on the story Elena had told them, the exclusive development, the appreciating neighborhood, the early access opportunity, then the transaction felt safe. The Chuns came 3 years later, in 2012. David and Susan Chun were in their early 60s. David was a physician. Susan was a hospital administrator. They had done everything right. They had earned high incomes. They had invested conservatively. They had built substantial retirement savings. But they had also watched their eldest son purchase a home in Lincoln Park before he was 30. They had watched their colleagues buy investment properties. They had watched the housing market appreciate dramatically, and they had begun to feel like they were not maximizing their assets, not taking full advantage of the market opportunity, not being as strategic as they should be. Susan had read about real estate investment strategies. She knew about cap rates and appreciation potential and leverage. She wanted to move their assets into real estate before they retired, to position themselves better financially. David was more cautious, but he trusted Susan's financial instincts. They had done well following her guidance. Elena approached them similarly, but with subtle adjustments. The Chuns were wealthier and more financially sophisticated than the Hendersons. Elena didn't need to sell them on the concept of real estate appreciation. She needed to sell them on exclusive access and strategic positioning. She positioned the property as a rare opportunity, a development that was being built by a major developer in a neighborhood that was appreciating faster than the broader market, available only to investors with sufficient capital and financial sophistication to understand the opportunity. David and Susan purchased the same property 3 years after the Hendersons, paying $525,000 for it. They had borrowed against their existing home to secure the down payment. They were confident in their decision. Elena had provided documentation. She had provided architectural plans. She had provided information about the developer, the neighborhood, the timeline. It all checked out, except that it didn't. Not because the information was false, but because the information was disconnected from the actual property. The development existed in documentation. It existed in the architectural renderings. It existed in the property deeds. But it did not exist on the ground, in the world, in the space where buildings are actually constructed and people actually live. What the Hendersons and the Chuns shared was not stupidity. They shared vulnerability. They shared the human need to believe in a narrative that promised them what they wanted. They shared the experience of being in a market that was volatile and uncertain, and they wanted someone who seemed to know more than they did. They wanted someone who seemed to have insider access, insider knowledge, insider certainty. Elena provided that. She provided the feeling of being chosen. She provided the feeling of having access to something exclusive. She provided the feeling of moving upward, of transcending their current position, of arriving at the security they'd been pursuing their entire lives. And the system, the professional system of brokers and lawyers and title companies and inspection services, provided the validation. Because Elena had fabricated documents so carefully that they passed the initial review. The deed was notarized. The title insurance was issued. The property was listed on the county assessor's website. All of the institutional markers of legitimacy were present. All of the systems designed to protect them had been incorporated into her deception and weaponized against them. The question that haunts the Hendersons and the Chuns is not, how could we have known? But rather, what does it mean that we wanted this badly enough to ignore the warning signs? Because there were warning signs, they were just easier to reframe as confirmation of the opportunity than as evidence of risk. And Elena understood this about human psychology better than they understood it about themselves. By 2010, Elena had shifted her entire operation. She was no longer working as a traditional real estate agent. She had created a company, Zenith Properties, LLC, that existed primarily in digital space. The company had a website. It had a professional address in downtown Chicago. It had a phone number that forwarded to her cell phone. It had an email address that connected to an email account she monitored obsessively. The website was the masterpiece. It contained property listings for developments that did not exist. The listings included architectural renderings that Elena had purchased from online stock image sites and recontextualized. She had taken generic architectural images of luxury developments and created narratives around them. The Jefferson Park development was actually a photo of a luxury complex in Denver. The Lincoln Park Residences was a rendering from a Toronto development. The images were real. The buildings they depicted did not exist in the locations described, but the website did more than display fraudulent listings. It created institutional legitimacy. It created the impression of an established company with a professional track record. Elena created fake testimonials from previous buyers. She created fake reviews, praising her professionalism and the quality of her properties. She created a LinkedIn profile with a professional headshot and a detailed employment history. The employment history was fabricated. She had worked as a broker for companies that did not exist, been recognized by organizations that were fictional, closed deals that had never happened. Each layer of fabrication reinforced the others. The website pointed to the company address. The company address could be verified. The testimonials referenced specific properties and transactions. The transactions could not be directly verified because they had happened in previous markets and previous development phases, but the narrative coherence was perfect. Elena had created a comprehensive fictional identity, and she had embedded it in enough verifiable infrastructure that most people could not distinguish between the fabricated and the real. The documentation was extraordinary. Elena had become proficient in document forgery, not through criminal expertise, but through careful study of legitimate documents. She understood that you did not need to perfectly replicate a document. You needed to replicate it well enough that a cursory review would not catch the deception. She obtained sample permits from the Chicago Department of Buildings and modified them. She created architectural plans using generic software. She created developer agreements that looked authentic because they were formatted like authentic documents. But the genius of Elena's infrastructure was that most of her victims never actually needed to verify the documents independently. They took them to their attorneys. Their attorneys reviewed them. And here is where the system failed. The attorneys were not specialists in real estate development. They were transaction attorneys. Their job was to verify that the buyer was purchasing the property according to the terms agreed upon, not to verify that the property was real or that the development was actually happening. Elena's documents were fraudulent, but they were internally consistent. All the signatures matched, all the terms aligned. The title search showed that the property had been registered with the county. From a transaction perspective, everything looked legitimate. The attorneys did their jobs. They protected their clients from transactional fraud, but they could not protect them from something more fundamental, the fabrication of reality itself. Elena had also created a network of accomplices, though most of them did not understand they were accomplices. She had hired a paralegal, a young woman named Jennifer, who needed work and asked few questions to handle documentation. Jennifer believed she was working for a legitimate property company. She did not understand that the permits she was processing were forged, that the developer agreements she was organizing were fabricated, that she was participating in an elaborate deception. Elena had also created professional personas. She hired voice actors to pose as developers, contractors, and inspectors on phone calls with her victim. She would arrange for a call between a prospective buyer and a representative of the development company. The voice actors were competent. They knew enough about construction terminology to sound convincing. They understood real estate processes well enough to answer questions without contradicting Elena's narrative. They had scripts, but they had also been given freedom to improvise, to adapt to specific questions, to create the impression of authentic conversation rather than rehearsed dialogue. The infrastructure of the deception was not simple fraud. It was the construction of an alternate reality so comprehensive that it encompassed multiple domains. The digital domain, the website, the email, the LinkedIn profile, the documentary domain, the permits, the deeds, the title searches, the physical domain, the property walkthroughs, the staged photographs, the interpersonal domain, the trusted advisors, the professional representatives, and the psychological domain, the narratives that made the deception emotionally compelling. Each domain reinforced the others. If someone doubted the website, they could verify the existence of the company by visiting the office. If they doubted the office, they could review the documents. If they doubted the documents, they could talk to a representative of the development company. If they doubted the representative, they could look at the property listing on the county assessor's website. The system was circular. Every doubt had a response. Every uncertainty had a resolution. Elena had created a closed loop of verification where every element confirmed every other element. And she had done this not out of sophisticated criminal planning, but out of the same skill that had served her since adolescence. The ability to read what people wanted and provide it. The ability to present herself as whatever was necessary to meet the psychological need. The ability to construct a convincing narrative of self that could exist in multiple registers: the professional register, the friendly register, the expert register, the trustworthy register. What is most striking about the infrastructure of Elena's deception is that it did not require cutting-edge technology or sophisticated criminal expertise. It required something much simpler and much more dangerous: a clear-eyed understanding of human psychology, a willingness to exploit that psychology, and an extraordinary attention to detail. Elena was not a technical genius. She was a psychologist. She understood how people think, what they believe, what they will overlook if the narrative is compelling enough. By 2012, Elena had become so invested in the infrastructure of her deception that she had lost track of the distinction between the fabricated and the real. She would look at her website and experience it as a legitimate company. She would listen to her voice actors and experience them as authentic representatives. She would review her forged documents and experience them as real permits. The infrastructure had become so elaborate, so comprehensive, that it had replaced her sense of reality. She was no longer a person committing fraud. She was a person running a business, a real business, with real clients, with real properties. This is the most dangerous phase of incremental deception. It's when the deceiver becomes their own primary victim, when the fabricated world becomes more real than the world that exists outside of it, when the cognitive dissonance, the gap between what the person knows to be true and what they are experiencing as true, becomes so large that the only way to resolve it is to collapse that gap entirely and commit fully to the fabricated reality. Elena Voss did not experience herself as a criminal. She experienced herself as an entrepreneur who had discovered a market gap and was filling it. She experienced her victims as customers who were purchasing an asset. She experienced the deception not as a crime, but as a service. And this is why she was able to continue for so long. She was not plagued by guilt. She was not torn between her conscience and her ambition. She had effectively silenced her conscience by reframing the entire enterprise as legitimate business. The infrastructure of her deception was not designed to fool her victims. It was designed to fool herself. It was a system of psychological reinforcement that allowed her to maintain a fictional identity so completely that it replaced her authentic self. And the tragedy of Elena Voss is not simply that she deceived others. It is that she became so dependent on that deception for her sense of self that she could not afford to let it collapse. The currency of Elena's deception was not money. Money was the medium, but the real commodity was access. Elena understood that in any competitive market, what people want more than anything is a sense of having transcended the competition. They want to believe that they have access to information, connections, or opportunities that others do not. They want to feel chosen. This need is particularly acute among people who have been successful through conventional means, but who sense that they have plateaued. They have done what they were supposed to do. They have made responsible decisions. They have played by the rules, but they have not transcended. They have not arrived at the kind of security or status or significance that they imagined they would achieve when they were younger. The real estate market amplifies this need because property is one of the last domains where an individual can still feel like they are making a genuinely strategic decision. Technology stocks are too abstract. Bonds are too passive. But real estate feels like you are doing something, like you are moving something, like you are making a real decision in a real market. Elena would identify her targets by understanding their psychological position. She would look for people who had done well, but not excellently. People who had stable incomes, but were not wealthy. People who were approaching retirement and wanted to feel like they were maximizing their final years of earning potential. People who were experiencing the first tremors of mortality and wanted to believe they were building something that would outlast them. People who had grown up modest and wanted to feel like they had transcended. Once she had identified her target, she would initiate contact with a very specific narrative. She would position herself not as a salesperson trying to make a commission, but as someone who had inside information and was willing to share it with the right person. She would suggest that she had access to exclusive opportunities that were not available to the general market. She would explain that she was selective about with whom she shared these opportunities. She was looking for investors who understood real estate fundamentally, who were financially sophisticated, who had the capital to move quickly. This narrative accomplished several things simultaneously. First, it positioned Elena as someone with power and access, someone in the inner circle. Second, it positioned her prospective clients as people worthy of that access, financially sophisticated, serious investors. Third, it created an implicit competition. She was looking for the right person. The implication was that there were other people she could be approaching, and if you did not act quickly, she would find someone else. The seduction of insider access works because it promises two things. First, that you are smarter than you are, and second, that you are more successful than you are. If you have inside access to a real estate opportunity that others do not have, then you are smart enough to recognize value that the market has missed. If you are successful enough to be offered this opportunity, then you belong to a different category of person than you might have believed. Marcus Henderson experienced this seduction profoundly. When Elena approached him, he was at a particular moment of vulnerability. He had taken early retirement. The identity that had structured his entire adult life, executive, manager, professional, had been stripped away. He was, for the first time in decades, without a clear role. He had time, he had money, but he did not have a sense of purpose or identity. When Elena positioned him as someone with the sophistication and capital to recognize a valuable real estate opportunity, she was offering him something that had nothing to do with money. She was offering him an identity. She was offering him the sense that he was still smart, still capable, still someone who could recognize value and make decisions that mattered. The property was secondary. The real transaction was the restoration of his sense of self. Susan Chun experienced a different but equally seductive version of this narrative. Susan had spent her career as a hospital administrator, making decisions that affected thousands of people. But those decisions were made within institutional constraints. She was answerable to other people. She was implementing systems designed by others. What she craved was autonomy. The feeling of making a strategic decision that was entirely her own, based on her own judgment, with her own capital at stake. When Elena positioned the property as an exclusive opportunity available only to financially sophisticated investors, she was offering Susan the feeling of exercising her intelligence and her judgment in a domain where there were no institutional constraints. She was offering her the feeling of being a player in a high-stakes game, and the fact that the opportunity was exclusive meant that not just anyone could access it. Only people like Susan, people with capital, with intelligence, with sophistication, could access it. The seduction of insider access also works because it operates beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. People do not typically recognize the moment when they shift from evaluating an opportunity based on its merits to evaluating it based on the identity it promises them. They experience the shift as a gradual accumulation of confidence. They experience it as increasing evidence that the opportunity is real. But what is actually happening is that they are becoming increasingly invested in the narrative because the narrative has become increasingly tied to their sense of self. Elena would reinforce this investment through a series of small intimacies. She would share inside information with her prospective clients that made them feel like they were on the inside of something. She would occasionally express concern about whether they should move forward, not because the opportunity was risky, but because the market was uncertain, and she wanted to make sure they were comfortable with the timeline. These moments of expressed concern actually deepened the bond. They created the impression that Elena cared about her clients' well-being, that she was looking out for them, that the relationship transcended a simple business transaction. She would also occasionally introduce moments of competitive urgency. She would mention that another client was interested in a similar property. She would express concern that the units would sell out. She would suggest that if Marcus or Susan were interested, they should move quickly. This urgency was not about missing out on a property. It was about missing out on the identity that the property promised. It was about the fear that someone else would be recognized as worthy of insider access while you were not. By the time Marcus and Patricia Henderson signed their purchase agreement with Elena, they were not primarily motivated by the expectation of financial returns. They were motivated by the desire to feel like they were still capable of making smart decisions. They were motivated by the desire to feel like they were still players in a game that mattered. They were motivated by the desire to belong to the world of people who had access to exclusive opportunities. Similarly, when David and Susan Chun signed their purchase agreement, they were motivated less by the financial opportunity than by the feeling of having exercised autonomous judgment in a high-stakes decision. They were motivated by the feeling of belonging to a category of sophisticated investors. They were motivated by the feeling that they were still capable of recognizing value that others missed. And Elena, who understood all of this perfectly, had simply provided what her clients were desperate to receive. She had provided a story in which they were the heroes of their own narrative, a story in which they were smart enough to recognize an opportunity, a story in which they were successful enough to access something exclusive, a story in which they were moving upward, transcending, arriving. The seduction of insider access is so powerful precisely because it offers something that cannot be easily falsified from within the narrative. Once you have accepted the premise that Elena has access to exclusive opportunities, then any doubt about the opportunity becomes interpreted as doubt about your own worthiness to have access. If the opportunity is not real, then Elena would not have offered it to you, which means you are not actually the kind of person she thought you were. The doubt becomes too threatening to consciousness. It gets suppressed. It transforms into confidence. This is why the discovery of the fraud is so devastating, not simply as a financial loss, but as an identity crisis. Marcus and Patricia do not simply lose money. They lose the sense of themselves as people who are still capable of making smart decisions. David and Susan do not simply lose capital. They lose the sense of themselves as autonomous, sophisticated investors. A fraud does not simply cost them money. It reveals that they were not the people they believed they were. It reveals that their judgment was not as sound as they thought. It reveals that they were vulnerable to a narrative precisely because the narrative confirmed their own self-image. And Elena, who had provided the seduction, did not experience this as a betrayal of trust. She experienced her client's disappointment as evidence that she had done her job perfectly. She had made them believe something that was not true. She had made them want something that did not exist. She had made them feel chosen. And in that moment of feeling chosen, they had been exactly who they wanted to be. The progression from initial contact to full investment follows a specific psychological pathway. Elena understood this pathway so thoroughly that she could guide people along it with almost algorithmic precision. Each stage built dependency, not just financial dependency, but psychological dependency. In the first stage, Elena establishes her credibility and expertise. She does this by sharing information that is both true and exclusive seeming. She will tell her prospective clients about neighborhood trends that are publicly available, but that she presents as inside knowledge. She will explain real estate market dynamics that are true, but that sound more sophisticated, coming from someone positioned as an insider. She builds the impression that she knows more than they do. In the second stage, she establishes the property as a specifically valuable opportunity. This is where documentation becomes crucial. She provides architectural renderings, permits, developer information, neighborhood analysis. All of this is presented as evidence of the property's legitimacy. But more importantly, all of this is presented as evidence that Elena has access to this information before the general market does. She is positioning herself as someone whose access precedes availability. If she knows about this property, and the property is real, then she must have genuine insider access. In the third stage, she creates exclusivity and urgency. She explains that the opportunity is not available to everyone. She suggests that the developer is being selective about buyers. She mentions that other investors are interested. She creates the impression that this particular client has been specifically chosen, but that the window for acceptance is limited. This is where psychological investment deepens significantly. The client is no longer simply considering a financial opportunity. They are considering whether they are worthy of being chosen. In the fourth stage, and this is where dependency becomes acute, she creates involvement and agency. She asks her clients to make decisions. She asks them whether they prefer the unit in the North Tower or the South Tower. She asks them how they plan to finance the purchase. She asks them what their timeline for occupancy is. She asks them about their investment goals and how this property fits into their broader financial strategy. These questions serve a specific function. They are not actually soliciting information that Elena needs. She already knows what her clients will choose and what their timeline is, because she has designed the narrative to make certain choices seem optimal. But by asking the questions and incorporating the answers into the emerging narrative, she transforms her clients from passive observers into active participants in the construction of the deception. They are no longer being sold something. They are creating something. They are building a story in which they are the protagonist. When Marcus Henderson decided that he preferred the unit with the better view of the adjacent green space, he was not simply expressing a preference. He was investing his imagination in a specific space. He was imagining himself standing at that window. He was imagining Patricia pointing out to a visiting family member the space where they would sit on summer mornings. He was imagining the specific configuration of his life in that place. The decision to prefer one unit over another became, in his mind, the act of choosing a future. Susan Chun did something similar when she decided that she wanted to use the property as an investment and that she planned to rent it out to young professionals. In making that decision, she was not simply identifying a financial strategy. She was constructing an identity as a real estate investor. She was imagining herself in the role of someone who understood markets and identified opportunities and made strategic decisions. The property became the material manifestation of that identity. In the fifth stage, Elena introduces a series of small obstacles and resolutions. She will mention that the financing is more complex than she initially anticipated. The developer requires the buyer to be represented by a specific attorney or to use a specific title company, or the permits are being processed more slowly than expected, and she is working with the city to expedite them, or the developer has specific requirements about buyer qualifications that she is attempting to get waived. Each of these obstacles seems legitimate. Each one seems like the kind of thing that would legitimately occur in a complex real estate transaction. And each time Elena resolves the obstacle by arranging a call with the developer, by contacting the city, by providing documentation, her client's trust in her deepens. She is not simply providing them with a property. She is solving problems on their behalf. She is going to bat for them. She is demonstrating loyalty and commitment. What is actually happening is more sinister. With each obstacle and resolution, Elena is deepening her client's dependency. She is creating a sense of alliance. She is creating the impression that she and her clients are working together against a system that is complex and sometimes resistant. She and her clients are a team, and teams trust each other. Teams have loyalty. Teams keep secrets. In the sixth stage, the stage where dependency reaches its apex, Elena introduces the concept of confidentiality and discretion. She will suggest to her clients that the opportunity is so exclusive that it needs to remain confidential. A developer does not want word getting out about the availability. The price would increase if other investors knew about it. The developer would prefer that their early buyers not discuss the purchase with others who might be interested. This confidentiality requirement accomplishes multiple things. First, it isolates her clients from external verification. They cannot talk to friends about the investment and risk having those friends question it. Second, it deepens the sense of exclusive access. The fact that the purchase is confidential is evidence that it is genuinely exclusive. Third, it creates a collusive bond. Elena and her clients are keeping a secret together. Secrets create intimacy. Secrets create loyalty. Marcus and Patricia Henderson would not discuss their purchase with their adult children because Elena had advised them that it was confidential and they did not want to jeopardize the opportunity. Susan and David Chun did not discuss the purchase with their colleagues for similar reasons. Elena had positioned confidentiality as a requirement of the investment, but it functioned as a requirement of the deception. As long as the purchase remained secret, it remained unquestioned. In the seventh stage, Elena deepens emotional investment by creating a false sense of progress and forward momentum. She will send her clients periodic updates on the construction. The updates are fabricated, but they are detailed and specific. She will include photos of the site. The photos are of empty lots, but she will accompany them with captions like "Foundation work beginning this week" or "Utility infrastructure installed." She will send updates about the permitting process. The updates are fictional, but they follow the timeline that would be typical for an actual development. These updates serve a crucial function. They create the impression that something is actually happening. They create the impression that the property is being built. They create the impression that her clients are moving toward occupancy, toward the realization of the imagined future they have invested so deeply in creating. They also create dependency in a specific form, temporal dependency. Her clients are now waiting for something. They are oriented toward a future moment when they will occupy this property. They have adjusted their life plans around this future moment. They have organized their finances around it. Some of them have made other decisions: early retirement, reduced hours at work, moving back to Chicago from other states, based on the expectation that this property would soon be available. Elena understands that the longer someone waits for something, the more invested they become in its reality. The longer you imagine your life in a space, the more real that space becomes in your mind. The longer you organize your practical life around a future event, the more you need that event to occur. Her clients are no longer simply waiting to purchase a property. They are waiting to become the people they have imagined themselves becoming. They are waiting for the narrative to resolve. And Elena, through a series of carefully orchestrated delays, extends that waiting. The construction timeline slips. The permitting takes longer. The developer encounters unforeseen complications. Each delay is disappointing, but each delay is also presented as temporary and solvable. Elena will arrange another call with the developer. She will contact the city again. She will assure her clients that these delays are not uncommon, that they will be resolved soon, that they should remain patient. What Elena is actually doing is extending the period of psychological investment. The longer her clients wait, the less likely they are to question the fundamental reality of the property. The longer they wait, the more their identity becomes tied to the belief in this property. By the time they finally arrive at the lot, expecting to begin their occupancy, they have such a profound emotional and psychological investment in the properties. Reality that any suggestion that it does not exist feels like a threat to their sense of self. This is the architecture of emotional dependency. It is not created through drama or urgency. It is created through small moments of alliance, through the sharing of secrets, through the construction of a shared narrative, through the deepening of investment in an imagined future. And it is so effective precisely because it follows the same pathways through which all genuine relationships are built. Elena's deception mimics the structure of authentic connection so thoroughly that her clients cannot distinguish between the two. By the time Marcus arrives at the lot in October 2012, 3 years after initially contacting Elena, he has been waiting for this moment since 2009. He has imagined this moment countless times. He has discussed this property with Patricia so extensively that it has become part of how they imagine their retirement. He has organized his life around the expectation of occupying this space. And when he discovers that the property does not exist, he does not simply lose money. He loses 3 years of imagined future. He loses the narrative in which he was still capable of making smart decisions. He loses the identity he had constructed around being someone who recognized value that others missed. This is why emotional dependency is so devastating when it collapses. It is not simply that someone has been defrauded. It is that someone has been manipulated into investing their own psychological resources into the construction of their own deception. Elena did not deceive Marcus. Marcus deceived himself. Elena simply provided a framework within which self-deception became not just possible, but inevitable. There is a moment in every deception where the trajectory shifts. There is a moment where the liar recognizes that the situation has become unsustainable, that the lies have multiplied beyond the point where they can be coherently maintained, that the consequence of continued deception has begun to exceed the benefits. This is the moment where the liar faces a choice: confess or deepen the deception further. Elena faced this moment in 2013. By that point, she had sold 17 properties across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. She had collected approximately $4.2 million from her victims. She had created elaborate documentation. She had manufactured a professional identity so comprehensive that she could not distinguish between her authentic self and her constructed self. She had also, for the first time, made a mistake. The mistake was small, but it was consequential. She had sold the same property twice. She had forgotten that she had already sold the Jefferson Park lot to Marcus and Patricia Henderson in 2009. In 2012, when Susan Chan expressed interest in a similar type of property in a similar neighborhood, Elena had offered her the same lot. This was not necessarily a disastrous mistake. People purchase multiple properties. Developers build multiple units on the same lot. If Elena had been more attentive, she could have addressed this problem by quickly selling one of her clients out of the deal with some fabricated explanation. A change in the developer's plans, a decision to modify the project, a competing buyer who had made a more attractive offer, but Elena did not address it. Instead, she simply maintained both deceptions simultaneously. She continued to provide updates to the Hendersons about their property. She continued to provide updates to the Chuns about their property. Both updates described the same lot undergoing construction. Both timelines described permits being finalized, infrastructure being installed, occupancy approaching. Why did Elena not address the mistake? This question gets at something fundamental about the psychology of incremental deception. By the time Elena had sold the same property twice, she was not in a psychological position to address the mistake through honest means. Honesty would require her to acknowledge the deception itself. And by 2013, acknowledging the deception would have meant acknowledging that her entire constructed identity was fraudulent. Elena could not afford to do that. Instead, she doubled down. She created additional fictional properties to sell to other clients. She fabricated additional documentation. She invested more time and psychological energy into maintaining multiple simultaneous deceptions. Each new deception was supposed to solve the problem created by the previous deception. But instead, each new deception created additional problems that required additional deceptions. This is the arithmetic of escalating lies. It is not linear. It is exponential. One lie creates the need for two lies. Two lies create the need for four. By the time Elena had sold 17 properties, she was maintaining 17 parallel fictional narratives. She was creating 17 sets of documentation. She was scheduling updates for 17 different sites. She was tracking 17 different timelines. She was managing 17 different emotional relationships with 17 different families. The cognitive load was immense. But more than the cognitive load, the emotional load was overwhelming. Because Elena had become so invested in her constructed identity as an insider, as a connector, as someone with access, that maintaining this identity required an enormous psychological effort. Every interaction with her clients required her to perform authenticity. Every conversation required her to suppress the knowledge of deception. Every documentation required her to suppress awareness of forgery. Elena began to show signs of stress. She worked excessive hours. She drank heavily. She experienced insomnia. She had moments of dissociation where she would be sitting in her office and would suddenly become aware of the fraudulent documents around her and would experience a moment of acute panic. She would then push the awareness away and return to the work of maintaining the deceptions. In early 2013, Elena's paralegal Jennifer noticed something unusual. Elena had instructed her to create permits for a property that Jennifer had processed permits for previously, but the permits were for a different lot, on a different street, with the same exact construction timeline. Jennifer asked Elena about this discrepancy. Elena's response was to immediately fire Jennifer and to pay her a substantial severance, along with a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for her silence. Jennifer, who did not understand the full extent of the deception, accepted the payment. She needed the job security that the settlement provided more than she needed to investigate her employer's behavior. But the interaction terrified Elena. For the first time, someone inside the infrastructure of her deception had begun to notice inconsistencies. For the first time, someone else might be beginning to understand what she had done. For the first time, Elena was not the only person who knew the truth. This should have been the moment where Elena confronted reality. This should have been the moment where she recognized that the deception had become unsustainable, that the moment had passed for damage control, that the only path forward was confession and acceptance of consequences. This was the decision point. This was the moment where the trajectory could have altered, and Elena did consider it. In the summer of 2013, Elena sat in her apartment and wrote a letter to the FBI. The letter was not a confession, but it was an acknowledgement. It was an attempt to control the narrative of her own exposure by preemptively revealing the fraud. The letter explained the scheme. It explained the psychological motivations behind it. It attempted to position Elena's actions as a product of circumstances and vulnerabilities rather than deliberate criminality. Elena began the letter multiple times. She would write a few paragraphs and then delete them. The letter was never sent. Why? Because sending the letter would have meant destroying everything. It would have meant the end of her constructed identity. It would have meant facing the people she had defrauded. It would have meant accepting the judgment of others. It would have meant confronting what she had done. And Elena was not capable of that. She had become too dependent on her constructed identity. She had organized her entire sense of self around the belief that she was not a criminal, that she was a legitimate operator, that the deceptions were not deceptions, but simply a different way of doing business. To admit the truth would be to demolish the psychological architecture that held her together. So Elena made the other choice. She deepened the deception. She created additional properties. She fabricated additional documentation. She invested more resources into maintaining the lies. She began planning how to exit the scheme, but not through confession, through escape. She considered moving her business to another state. She considered creating additional shell companies. She considered ways to distance herself from the most obvious frauds while continuing to operate in a more discreet manner. But as she was planning her escape, the Hendersons contacted her with a specific request. They wanted to schedule a final walkthrough before closing. They wanted to confirm that the property was ready for occupancy. The closing date was approaching. Elena's calendar showed that she had the Chuns scheduled for a property walkthrough on the exact same day. This was the moment. This was the moment where the exponential arithmetic of escalating lies reached critical mass. This was the moment where maintaining multiple simultaneous deceptions became mathematically impossible. This was the moment where all of the decisions Elena had made, all the small choices to lie a little further, to deepen the deception a little more, to extend the timeline a little longer, converged into a single impossible moment. Elena could not be in two places at the same time. She could not schedule two separate property walkthroughs for the same property. She could not provide two different families with keys to the same lot. She could not escort one family through the property while the other family was arriving. The deception had reached the point of logical impossibility. What Elena did in the days before this moment is not fully documented. But what is documented is that on October 15th, 2013, she did not show up for either appointment. She did not call. She did not provide an explanation. She simply disappeared. Her office was abandoned. Her phone was disconnected. Her email account was closed. The woman who had spent 4 years constructing an elaborate fictional identity simply stepped out of that identity and disappeared into the world. She left no note. She left no explanation. She left two families standing in an empty lot, holding deeds to a property that did not exist, and understanding for the first time the full magnitude of the deception they had believed in. The collapse did not come as a dramatic revelation. It came as an absence. And the absence was, in many ways, more devastating than discovery would have been. Because as long as Elena was engaged with her clients, she was actively constructing a narrative that explained the delays, that promised resolution, that maintained hope. Her absence stripped away all of that. Her absence forced her clients to confront the possibility that they had been deceived, that nothing was coming, that the future they had imagined was not going to occur. And Elena, who had constructed her entire identity around being someone who could manage narratives and control reality, discovered that there was one narrative she could not manage, the narrative of her own exposure. There was one reality she could not control, the reality of her own deception coming to light. And so she simply stopped trying. She abandoned the constructed identity and became someone else entirely, a person without a name, without a location, without a known occupation, a person who had disappeared from the world because the only world where she had been able to exist was the world she had fabricated. The moment when the Hendersons and the Chuns arrived at the same property on October 15th, 2013, represents the collision of two realities. Or rather, it represents the moment when two people, and then two families, were forced to accept that the reality they had been living in had never existed at all. The Hendersons had arrived first. Marcus had taken the day off work. Patricia had arranged for time away from her dental practice. They were prepared for a significant emotional moment, the moment when they would finally see their property ready for occupancy. They had imagined this moment. They had talked about it. They had discussed where furniture would go, what colors they would paint the walls, how they would arrange their life in this space. When they arrived at the lot and found Elena was not there, they were initially unconcerned. Real estate transactions often involve minor delays. Showing times get pushed back. Representatives get held up in traffic. They waited. The Chuns arrived 20 minutes later, and in that moment, two separate narratives collided. The Hendersons saw another couple arriving with papers in their hands. The Chuns saw another couple already on the lot. And in that moment, before anyone spoke, everyone understood. The looks exchanged between the two couples contained within them the moment of recognition that something was wrong. Marcus approached David. "Are you here to see the property?" he asked. David hesitated. "Yes," he said. We own a property here." Patricia and Susan introduced themselves. David and Susan showed Patricia and Marcus their deed. Marcus and Patricia showed David and Susan theirs. The deeds were nearly identical. The lot number was the same. The purchase date was different, but the description of the property was the same. For a moment, there was silence. It is difficult to capture the specific quality of this silence. It was not the silence of confusion, though there was confusion. It was not the silence of anger, though there would be anger soon. It was the silence of reality shifting, the silence of the world rearranging itself, the silence of understanding that something they had believed with certainty was not true. Susan was the first to speak. "I think," she said, "we should call the city." The Chicago Department of Buildings had no record of a building permit for the construction described in either deed. The county assessor, when contacted, confirmed that the lot was indeed registered, but no active development was listed. By evening, the police had been called. By the next day, investigators had begun reviewing the documentation provided by both families. What they discovered was extraordinary in its comprehensiveness. Elena had created a parallel infrastructure of fraud. She had created deeds that appeared legitimate because they included legitimate lot numbers and legal descriptions. She had created permits that appeared legitimate because they were formatted like legitimate permits. She had created developer agreements that appeared legitimate because they included the names of real development companies. But when investigators actually contacted the developers, they discovered that those companies had never heard of Elena when they contacted the title insurance company that had allegedly issued the title insurance. They discovered no record of the transaction. When they attempted to verify the architectural firm that had ostensibly designed the property, they discovered the firm did not exist. What emerged was a crime of extraordinary scope and sophistication. Elena had sold 17 properties across 3 states. She had victimized 31 individual investors. She had collected over $4, $2 million. And she had done it not through the use of advanced technology or elaborate criminal networks, but through a clear-eyed understanding of how people think and what they will believe. The Hendersons and the Chuns became the primary focus of the investigation because they had simultaneously arrived at the same property. But there were others. There was a woman in Madison who had purchased a property that, when investigators went to investigate, was located in a neighborhood that was currently experiencing severe flooding. The property had been marketed as waterfront, but the documentation never mentioned flood risk. There was a man in Milwaukee who had purchased 2 properties from Elena. He had been paying property taxes on both properties to an account Elena had established for the development company. Neither property was real. As investigators traced back through Elena's history, they began to reconstruct not just the crimes, but the person who had committed them. They interviewed people who had worked with Elena. They found her paralegal, Jennifer, who provided them with access to Elena's files. They found voice actors who had been hired to play developers and contractors. They found the graphic designers who had created the architectural renderings. Piece by piece, the infrastructure of the deception began to become visible, and they discovered something that complicated the narrative of straightforward crime. No one involved in the infrastructure of the deception fully understood the extent of what they were participating in. The voice actors thought they were involved in some kind of marketing research or advertising production. The graphic designers thought they were working on architectural visualizations for a legitimate company. The paralegal thought she was working for a legitimate real estate firm. Elena had created so many layers of separation that people could participate in her deceptions without fully understanding what they were being asked to do. But the emotional impact on the primary victims was not complicated. The Hendersons lost $45,000 down payment and 3 years of projected future. Patricia developed anxiety severe enough that she required medication. Marcus became convinced that his judgment could not be trusted, and he became paralyzed in his decision-making. They discovered that they were not unique in this experience. The Chuns had similar psychological responses: shame at having been deceived, anger at themselves for not having been more careful, disruption to their relationship, as they each blamed the other for not catching red flags. But what is crucial to understand is that the red flags they believed they should have caught did not exist. There were no flags. The deception was too comprehensive. The narrative was too coherent. The documentation was too convincing. These were not people who had failed to do due diligence. These were people who had done exactly what they were supposed to do. They had reviewed the documents. They had consulted with attorneys. They had investigated the neighborhood. And all of those actions had reinforced the deception because Elena had embedded her lies within a context of truth that made the lies invisible. What the Hendersons and the Chuns discovered, and what Elena had understood all along, is that verification is not a reliable protection against deception. You cannot verify your way out of a lie that is told so completely, so comprehensively, that it encompasses everything you would check. You cannot protect yourself through due diligence if the person deceiving you understands how due diligence works and has designed their deception to pass through all of the checkpoints. In the months following the discovery, both families pursued legal remedies. They sued Elena, though she remained absent. They sued the title insurance company, alleging that the title insurance should have protected them. They contacted the Chicago Police Department. They eventually settled with the title insurance company for a portion of their losses. But neither family recovered their full investment. The psychological impact extended beyond financial loss. The Hendersons' marriage never fully recovered from the strain of the deception. Patricia went into therapy. Marcus withdrew socially. They moved back to Milwaukee, unable to remain in Chicago without being confronted by the physical location of their betrayal. The Chuns experienced their own relationship strain. David blamed Susan for pushing them toward the investment. Susan blamed David for not being more skeptical. They did recover financially more fully than the Hendersons, but the emotional damage was comparable. Susan eventually left her position at the hospital and moved into a less demanding role. The investment had shaken her confidence in her professional judgment, which had previously been the foundation of her self-concept. What neither family fully recognized until much later was that they had not simply been victims of fraud. They had been participants in their own deception. They had constructed narratives about themselves, Marcus as someone who could still make smart decisions, Patricia as someone who deserved a fresh start, David as a sophisticated investor, Susan as someone capable of autonomous judgment, and Elena had simply provided the material in which those narratives could be constructed. The tragedy of fraud like this is that it does not simply steal money. It steals the ability to trust your own judgment. It creates a gap between who you thought you were and who you understand yourself to be. And that gap does not close easily, even when it is filled with rational understanding that you were not stupid, that you were not careless, that you were simply human. And humans are vulnerable to deception when the deception is crafted skillfully enough. Years later, Marcus would still occasionally wonder whether there had been something Elena could have pointed to, some moment where he should have recognized the fraud. He would still occasionally think about contacting her, if anyone could locate her, just to ask her why, just to understand what she had been thinking, just to know whether she had been deceiving him specifically, or whether he had simply been one among many, whether the relationship they had constructed, however illusory, had meant something to her, or whether she had been entirely emotionally absent from the interaction. These questions contain within them a profound misunderstanding. Elena had not been emotionally absent. She had been emotionally fully present. She had cared deeply about crafting the perfect narrative. She had invested immense energy in understanding what her clients needed to believe. She had been intimately engaged in creating the deception. What had been absent was not emotion. What had been absent was honesty. And perhaps this is the most important insight that the collision of these two realities offers. We are vulnerable not to people who are emotionally distant or who are operating purely out of greed. We are vulnerable to people who care deeply about understanding us, who invest energy in meeting our psychological needs, who show genuine interest in our well-being. We are vulnerable to people who give us what we want, even when what we want is not what is good for us. Elena had given the Hendersons and the Chuns what they wanted, a story in which they were still capable, still smart, still worthy of exclusive access. She had taken their own deepest hopes and desires and had woven them into a narrative of deception so seamless that they could not distinguish between the narrative and reality. And in that indistinguishability lies the terrible power of what she had done. What Elena Voss understood, and what her victims eventually came to understand, is that the human mind does not process reality in the way we believe it does. We do not first perceive something and then evaluate whether it is true. We first construct a narrative, and then we perceive the world through the lens of that narrative. We are creatures of story before we are creatures of logic. Elena was a master of narrative construction, but more specifically, she was a master of recognizing what story someone wanted to tell about themselves, and then providing the material in which that story could be constructed. She understood that people do not want to be lied to about external facts. They want to be confirmed in their internal narratives. The market provides perfect conditions for this kind of deception because real estate exists at the intersection of multiple domains. It is a financial transaction, but it is also the projection of identity. It is an investment, but it is also a dream. It is a material good, but it is also the repository of hope about the future. When someone purchases property, they are not simply buying shelter. They are buying a story about who they are and who they will become. Elena exploited this by positioning herself not as a salesperson, but as someone who understood that story. She positioned herself as someone who could translate the internal narrative into external reality. And her clients, believing that she understood them, believed her. This tells us something important about vulnerability. Vulnerability to deception is not a sign of stupidity. It is, paradoxically, a sign of something closer to openness. It is a sign of the capacity to imagine alternative futures. It is a sign of the ability to hope. It is a sign of having invested psychological resources into the belief that transformation is possible. The people most vulnerable to deception are often not the people with the least judgment. They are the people with the deepest hopes. They are the people most invested in the idea that reality can be different than it currently is. They are the people most willing to believe in the possibility of transcendence. Elena's victims were not naive. They were aspirational. They had, all of them, clawed their way to some form of success. They had, all of them, overcome obstacles and made smart decisions. They had, all of them, believed that through effort and attention, they could create better lives for themselves. And Elena, who understood this completely, had simply weaponized their own best qualities against them. Where is Elena Voss now? The investigation revealed that she disappeared, but it did not reveal where she went. She did not resurface using her own name. No one has claimed to have encountered her in the years since the discovery of the fraud. It is possible she left the country. It is possible she established a new identity. It is possible she found a different way to operate. But what is most likely is that Elena Voss simply stopped existing. Not in the sense of death, though that is possible, but in the sense that the identity that had sustained her, the identity of the insider, the connector, the woman with access, could no longer be maintained. And without that identity, she did not know how to exist. This is the ultimate tragedy of Elena's story. She did not simply destroy the futures of the people she defrauded. She destroyed her own future. She built an identity so elaborate, so comprehensive, so dependent on deception, that when the deception was exposed, there was nothing left. There was no authentic self to return to. There was no person beneath the constructed persona. There was only the construction itself. This raises a question that extends beyond Elena's story. It is a question about all of us. How much of our identity is authentic, and how much of it is constructed? How much of who we are is who we genuinely are, and how much of it is the performance of self that we have learned works in the world? How many of us, given the right circumstances, might construct something similar to what Elena constructed, not fraud in the technical sense, but a version of ourselves that is more compelling than we are, that promises more than we are capable of delivering, that we have invested so deeply in that returning to authenticity feels like death? Elena Voss is the extreme version of a tendency that exists in all of us. She is what happens when the construction of self becomes total, when the gap between the authentic and the performed becomes absolute, when the integration between who we are and who we pretend to be breaks down completely. This is where psychology and morality intersect, because there is no simple answer to whether Elena is a criminal or a victim of her own psychology. She is both. She is someone who made choices that caused real harm, and she is someone who became so trapped in the consequences of those choices that she eventually disappeared. She is someone who should be held accountable, and she is someone we can understand. The question that Elena's story leaves us with is whether understanding can coexist with judgment, whether we can acknowledge someone's psychological vulnerability while also holding them responsible for their actions, whether we can recognize that deception often comes from a place of psychological desperation without excusing the harm it causes. The people defrauded by Elena did not have the luxury of understanding her psychology. They had the experience of betrayal. They had the experience of discovering that someone they had trusted, someone they had allowed into the project of constructing their future, had been engaged in wholesale fabrication. Their task has been to rebuild trust in other people, in institutions, and most importantly, in their own judgment. For Marcus Henderson, this process took years. He eventually returned to financial investing, but he approached it differently. He developed a hypervigilance that was exhausting but necessary. He became unable to make decisions without extensive verification. He became, in some ways, a different person, more cautious, more skeptical, less able to dream. For Susan Chun, the process involved a different kind of transformation. She left her position in hospital administration and eventually returned to school to become a social worker. Her experience of being defrauded led her to work with other people who had been victims of fraud and exploitation. She transformed her own wound into the capacity to witness others' wounds. These transformations are not redemptive in the way we often think about redemption. They are not recoveries to an earlier state. They are adaptations. They are ways of moving forward in a world that has revealed itself to be less safe, less predictable, less knowable than previously believed. Elena Voss's absence continues to structure the lives of the people she defrauded. She is not present, but she is not absent. She exists as a whole in their understanding. She exists as the person who revealed something about the world that they cannot unknow. She exists as the representation of all of the ways we are vulnerable, all of the ways our deepest hopes can be weaponized against us, all of the ways the gap between appearance and reality can be exploited. The central question of Elena's story is not, how did she do it? The techniques of fraud are, in many ways, ordinary. Forgery is not sophisticated. The exploitation of psychological vulnerability is not novel. What is extraordinary about Elena's story is not the method, but the scale. It is the comprehensiveness of the deception. It is the way that a single person, through nothing more than an understanding of human psychology and a willingness to exploit it, could construct a parallel infrastructure of reality. But perhaps the most important question is the one that Elena herself never answered. At what moment, if any, could she have stopped? At what point was there still a choice? Was there a moment early in the deception when honesty would have been possible? Was there a turning point after which the fraud became inevitable? Or was the trajectory determined from the moment Elena first recognized that she could meet people's psychological needs through fabrication? These questions do not have answers, but they point towards something crucial: the recognition that deception is not simply a choice. It is a form of psychological integration. It is a way of organizing the self. It is a way of managing the gap between who we are and who we want to be. And once you have organized your entire identity around the management of that gap, the gap becomes your life. The maintenance of the deception becomes the thing that keeps you alive. Elena Voss lived for 18 years in this state of total deception. She did not experience herself as suffering. She experienced herself as transcending. She experienced the people she defrauded not as victims, but as participants in a different kind of reality. She experienced her actions not as crime, but as a particular form of psychological work. This is the horror and the humanity of her story combined. She was not a monster operating outside of human psychology. She was someone who had taken the ordinary human tendencies toward narrative construction and self-creation to their logical extreme. She had simply extended what all of us do, in smaller ways every day. She had created a version of herself that was more compelling than the truth. She had made people believe in her, and she had organized her entire existence around the maintenance of that belief. In the end, the most significant consequence of Elena Voss's deception was not the money stolen or the financial losses suffered. It was the revelation it offered about the fragility of shared reality. If Elena Voss could construct such an elaborate deception, if she could fool so many people, if she could make so many people believe in something that did not exist, what does that tell us about the nature of certainty itself? The answer is both simple and terrible. Certainty is fragile. Reality is constructed. Trust is always a form of faith. And the people we are most vulnerable to deceiving us are the people who understand what we want to believe. Elena Voss disappeared into the absence she created. She became, in the end, like the properties she had sold, something that existed entirely in documentation, entirely in narrative, entirely in the space between what was promised and what was real. She became a story about absence. She became the void at the center of the architecture of deception. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending for someone who had built a life entirely on the construction of illusion. She became an illusion herself, a person remembered only through the deception she created, existing only in the narratives that her victims continued to construct to make sense of what happened to them.